Welcome to the YouTube channel for Loughborough's Yoldy Parish Church, All Saints with Holy Trinity. It's great to welcome you this Tuesday lunchtime. If you are a regular here on Tuesdays, you will know, I hope, that you're in for a treat, because each Tuesday lunchtime I meet with 3 other preachers, people ministering in different parts of the country, in different contexts, perspectives, and we take a little look at the Revised Common Lectionary readings that are set for this Sunday coming up. The Revised Common Lectionary is a pattern of readings that lots of Christians all around the world follow, goes through a 3-year cycle, and helps us kind of attend to the different themes, theological themes, stories that are in the scriptures. And each year focuses on a different gospel. This year we're in Mark. Mark being the shortest gospel, we also get bits of John in there as well, but that's where we are. And of course it also really connects with the liturgical seasons of the year, if that's your kind of thing. But if it's not your kind of thing, if you're from a church that doesn't really use the lectionary, it's just the Bible, so enjoy it. You know, it's just the Bible, it's the Bible text, and we have a conversation about what we're noticing, and then also how we might preach them. How might we approach sermon writing? What might be God saying to us and to the communities that we're part of at this particular time? So if you're joining us live on this Tuesday lunchtime, if you're having your sandwich or your bowl of soup or whatever it is, if you're having a break from homeschooling, no such thing as a break, or get the kids to watch, this could be good, but join in and say hello in the comments. Let us know you're here, and join in the conversation. What strikes you in the passages that we're looking at? What questions do they raise for you? What kind of sermon would you preach? What kind of sermon would you like to hear? We would love to have you join in with us. So today my guests, I'm going to reveal them to you on the gallery view. Da, 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 da. Here they are, familiar face on the bottom right of my screen, and 2 new people joining us today. So while I type up into the comments the passages that we're looking at today, I'm going to get my guests to introduce themselves so you know who we're musing with this Tuesday lunchtime. Thanks.
And I'm on mute. Yes. Hi everyone, I'm Rachel Firth. I am the Vicar of Huddersfield in West Yorkshire, which is a big town centre church in the middle of a post-industrial area, and I've been here with you before. This Lent at my church, we're doing a lot of things at home, but starting to be quite excited about what it might look like to emerge at the end of Easter, and also trying not to be too excited just in case those dates move and we can't. But that's where we are, where I am.
Hi everyone, I'm Elizabeth York. I'm chaplain to 4 schools in Loughborough Schools Foundation. It's my first time here today with everyone. It's good to be here. Lent for me this year has started with some quite intentional reading and just sort of creating some space, really, I suppose making the most of the lockdown space that we have. So last night's announcement was met with a bit of mixed feeling from me, because I'm going to have to work out how to continue with that in the context of probably a much busier working pattern once we get back to school on the 8th of March.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Mohammed, and I'm originally from Iran. And as my name suggests, I come from Muslim background. I used to be asylum seeker, then joined Church of England, and it's great to be here. Lent for me, actually, after many years, I decided to become vegetarian, so not having meat, which make my wife life a bit difficult. I'm sorry about that. But I think it helps me so far very good to control it, and also we reading a book, Things in Babylon, in our home group. I don't know if you can see it or not, which is quite interesting. It's about the story of Daniel in exile. It's a lot of connection with my life, and as you know, Daniel was in the Persian Empire. I come from Iran, linked to the Persian Empire and so on. So yes, I'm so exciting this particular Lent.
Thank you everyone. My name is Wendy, and my Lent is being shaped by the Crown and the Cross, which is our reflection as a church on Azariah Franz Williams's book Ghost Ship. So that is what Lent is shaping up like. On a personal level, I've decided to fast from biscuits and chocolate and wine, just because if I don't fast from something, then it just keeps me on the straight and narrow, the wiggly road towards the cross. Anyway, so that's what I'm doing. Well, it's lovely to welcome folks are here. Vanessa is here, Andrew, Rachel, Hannah. Great to have you with us this Tuesday lunchtime. And if you're here as well and you've not commented, but you're just really welcome, and please do join in with us as we go along. So we always begin by looking at the gospel reading, and this week the passage is Mark chapter 8 verse 31 to 38. We always say on the Muse it's really important to look at the context where the little section comes out of. Just because the lectionary defines it, you are allowed to look at other verses in your preparation and even as you preach. And this comes just after Peter's declaration that Jesus is the Messiah. And then this lovely little cameo where basically Jesus says, yeah, being the Messiah means I'm going to suffer and die. And Peter says, don't tell anyone that. And then they have this little exchange. And then Jesus tells us that anyone who wants to follow him has to pick up their cross, deny themselves and follow him. Maybe very, very familiar words. But what does it mean for us? What's speaking to you? Rachel, I think you were going to kick off. Yeah, but you are still muted, so press the magic mute button. But share with us, what struck you this time as you read this passage?
I always love the passages where Peter puts his foot in it. And the glory of Peter for me is the getting it wrong and the getting it right. He's just made this wonderful heartfelt declaration about Jesus being the Messiah, and then he's completely gone off in the wrong direction with it. And it's so human, isn't it? It's so us. I've learned something now, and isn't this great? And I'm going to take it off in this direction. And Jesus really has to rein him in. Really has, get thee behind me, Satan. You have missed the point. And yeah, Peter's humanity in that always speaks to me when I read this passage. But the thing that's really niggling in my brain this year as I read this is about the identity and the self. I don't know if you in previous years when I've preached on this deny yourself. Deny yourself who I am, the same me who I'm supposed to love myself. Because if I can't love myself, I don't know how to love my neighbor, because I'm not at peace with myself as a human being. So how can I be at peace with the humanity of others? And I've preached repeatedly on that, but this year, something about how that relates to the selves that we have found during the pandemic, the things that have fallen away, which it turns out perhaps weren't part of ourselves, the things that we have missed the most, perhaps not even thinking that we would, but the things that we have suddenly realized are huge gaping holes in ourselves, in our lives, because of the restrictions. And how this year we might be relating differently to the sense of self. And actually how then that comes in with deny yourself. Because I've never thought Jesus was saying, deny who you really are.
Yeah.
So I think previously I've kind of worked through this as, thinking of the self as the selfish, as that next level up of only the self, where that's what things revolve around. But so to deny that, but actually in the pandemic, perhaps something of our real selves has been revealed. Yeah.
Wow.
So
You want to go on?
Yeah, and I randomly saw a documentary on the BBC this week talking about Ayn Rand, the philosopher. I don't know if you've ever come across, but post-war objectivism, and basically saying that sacrifice for the greater good is a complete waste of time, and that the whole history of sort of Judeo-Christian, all that philosophy is out the window now, and it's all about self-actualization. And there is so much in our culture which traces itself back to that way of thinking. and that this passage is the exact well, you know, self-sacrifice doesn't get you anywhere. Well, we follow the Jesus who proved that doing the thing that doesn't make sense, doing the thing that doesn't follow the philosophically logical path, is actually the thing that transforms the whole of creation.
Yeah.
And that's an idea that's in my head as we approach the weekend too.
Wow, thank you. It's really interesting, isn't it? When we come to scripture at different times, we're drawn to a particular tiny bit, and it just gets us in the gut. And often we've talked about this before in the Muse as well, that sometimes passages can be heard really unhelpfully to people, and the sense of self-suffering can be heard really unhelpfully. It can keep people in domestically violent relationships. It can reaffirm structures that abuse and suffer, because it's kind of like, well, it's a godly thing to do, to suffer. And I'm fascinated that you were really drawn to that. Sue Wallace, who's joined us this afternoon. Hi there, Sue. She says to you, Rachel, is denying yourself sometimes the best way of loving yourself, e.g. too much food, smoking, denying will to sit on the sofa all the time, and going and doing exercise? So maybe there is something about the loving of self, but that's a really interesting kind of tension to kind of explore in a sermon, I would think. Mohammed, what about you when you read this passage? Where were you drawn to? Or was there something in that Rachel said you thought, yeah, that's where I would go to?
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I think that's the essence of this passage, which is yourself and yourself with God. Because the previous one, obviously, the Son of Man has to suffer, which Jesus said, I deny myself because of you. So the suffering, we look at the Genesis and Roman later on, and the justification and how we connected to God. This self, Jesus himself, deny himself for me and you to connect to God. And then Peter said, no, you can't do that, because we love you so much. Where do you want to go? I want to become a general. I want to start a government. Where do you want to go? I said, no, because you're just merely human concern. I think that's the things, if we distinguish the loving yourself and deny yourself. What is the merely human concern? What is God concern? If he was merely human concern, then Jesus wouldn't deny himself, and he wouldn't go to the cross. But because it was God's concern, because it was God's planning, then deny yourself is easier. At the same time, you can love yourself. Yeah. So in a concept, if you forget God's concept somewhere out, and it doesn't relate it to me, loving yourself is everything. But when you bring a God inside the occasion and we say, what do you want me to do? Then it comes to deny yourself. And I have to say, coming from Islamic background, obviously Muslim doesn't believe Jesus was crucified. He was raptured. And here is magnifying to say, actually, if you take away the crucifixion and Jesus suffering, nothing left from Christianity. It's just become you and you alone. But with the cross and crucifixion, the deny yourself will become reality. That's why I can deny myself, because God has done it before me.
Yeah, thank you. The power of the cross, we don't always hear how both offensive and radical it is. I think I've lost any sense of time in the last year, but it may have been 2 years ago when Tom Hollander's book came out, Dominion, which I just think is a brilliant read. And what really came across in that, he talks about Christianity and how it's really seeped, in our Western culture and all the rest of it, and how it shapes all of us in ways we don't even really recognize. But he talks really powerfully about just how radical the notion of the cross is, and the sort of the appropriation of a symbol of power and torsion the authority, and it's completely turned around. And the power of the cross. Elizabeth, as you've been listening to Rachel and Mohammed and your own reflections on this passage, where do you land as you read it?
I suppose trying to sort of hold some of these things together, that idea of authority and power that you were talking about there, and then the comments about the sort of thoughts around identity and Rachel said something about who you really are with God. The verse that stuck out for me was this, the one where Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, as we've already talked about. And it's that sense of, I think, where he's what he's wanting to step into and help the disciples understand that he's stepping into a different sense of that name, the Messiah that he's been called. It's not that that Roman power and authority that that he's not challenging that in the way that they thought he would. So there is that sense of him needing to say, no, that is my name, but this is what that name means. This is my identity. This is who I am. And how important that is to establish that, so that he can, he's going to then go on and explain what that means, how he's going to live that identity. So yeah, I suppose it was a question that arose out of that for Lent might be something along the lines of, what names do we give ourselves that are the wrong names, and what do we need to let go of, at this time, so that we can be who we are, who we are in God's eyes. So that turning back to God and how God sees us, Yeah.
Thank you. I could see Rachel had a little moment when you were speaking that. do you want to respond to that, Rachel? Your little light bulb went on.
Yeah, I just recognise that really, sort of the identity stuff really resonated, but that the way we talk to ourselves and about ourselves, and it's not even, it's not even the casual Facebook posts or the, sort of this. We do it all the time. I'm probably being an idiot, but well, I'm, the excuses and the names we call ourselves. That's just, I think, a really hugely positive thing, Elizabeth, to hear you say that. Thank you.
That's all right. And if we go back to the Peter idea of him, where we started with him sort of messing up, it's that sense of, look, we are in all of that, as we hear those voices, I'm this, I'm that, we accept this time that we are, fallen, broken, messed up, mixed up, but then God sees us through a different lens, and we can turn away from that and embrace, a different way of thinking about ourselves through him and in him.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm just going to bring in some of the comments as we see everyone joining in the conversation. Chris Taylor, hi Chris, says, is there something in here that suggests denying yourself is more to do with affirming the Jesus way of love? And when we commit to the Jesus way, we find out more about the community we live in. Thank you for that, Chris. Andrew says, we don't have to suffer the way Jesus did. That was his job. We do need to put him and others first, though. Our temptation is our own egos first. Thank you very much for that, Andrew. And Hannah says, love that idea, Elizabeth, of the names we call ourselves. Shall we we nearly always come around again, and these passages do speak into each other. Let's just park the gospel for a moment, and I think we'll go next to our first text, or our Hebrew text, our Old Testament text, which is from Genesis. So last week the lectionary set us up with the covenant with all of creation, with all flesh, the covenant out of the ark with Noah, and this week we come to Genesis 17 verse 1 to 7, and then it jumps to verses 15 to 16. No, particularly in Anglican churches like mine, we can't listen to too much, otherwise we fall asleep. So there's two edited bits, and we get the covenant with Abraham as he at that point, and Sarai, although I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, and they become Abraham and Sarah, and it's the covenant to all nations. Mohammed, you were going to kick us off on this text. When you read this, what is speaking to you at this time?
Yes, I think, again, I like to compare it a little bit with Islam, because it's quite interesting to see these two stories, Ibrahim in Islam and Ibrahim in Christianity and Judaism. Because in Islam, Ibrahim was a young man who opposed the idols in Palestine. He broke them, and then they wanted to ban him. It's like a kind of the Daniel story. And then God came and rescued him. And then as a result, God gave him the land, the Palestine land. And then in another verses, and that's why his faith is important. His faith is for both Muslim and Christians important, as well as the connection through the Isaac and Ishmael. Another important verse in Quran, I think, is when Ibrahim was tested, which we believe is because of Isaac, but the Shia, which has come from, they believe is because of Ishmael. He's supposed to to sacrifice, but it doesn't matter. But he passed his test, and then God said he satisfied the test. This is the Quran verse, Surah 2 verse 124. And he said, God said, I'm appointing you as the leader of mankind. As a leader of mankind. And then he asked, will this leadership also continue through my descendants? The Lord replied, the unjust do not have right to exercise my authority. So in a sense, the same character, but different take, different branch. For Christianity, for us, Ibrahim was appointed, as Paul said, a good man. He out of grace and out of his faithfulness, he given the promise and given the land, which in verse 8, it took out in a Bible reading today, but the whole land was given to him. But in Islam was out of his doing something. And I think this is important here, because this is the base we building up ourselves. What is the base we are connected to God? Is it my doing something? Is it I'm going to the church, I'm doing the charity, I'm reading the Bible, I'm praying? So God, why don't you love me? Or is it to say, God loves me anyway? If I'm man or woman, gay or lesbian or straight or Christian or Muslim or whatever come from, whatever, if I'm asylum seeker or not asylum seeker, if I'm a British or non-British, God loves me. And I think that's magnifying this wonderful promise. God loved Abraham. Then he gave him the promise. Then he gave him the father of the nations. And that's and another thing I say, and leave it to others. Sarah is not eliminated here. In a very dominant society, patriarchal society, God doesn't say, I bless you, I bless Sarah. Sarah is changing the name is for both of them, blessing for both of them, and she become mother of nation in verse 21, as well as Abraham become father of nations. So that's wonderful passage of God to recognize both gender at the same time.
Yeah. Thank you. What a great place to start us off, and thank you for bringing that perspective. Often it is the difference in text, isn't it, where we might notice what is really important, what is distinctive about this message that we take from these scriptures. Elizabeth, do you want to come in next? Because I was struck, you brought us into the idea of thinking about naming earlier when we were talking about the Messiah thing, and obviously the naming is really big in this. When you read it, what do you bring to it when you look at this?
Yes, again, name, I was going to say name was big for me, obviously, in this. It's that sense of, Abraham, again, needs some wisdom on how to pronounce it correctly, but he thinks of himself in one way, and then God invites him into this journey of, becoming and growing in his vocation and becoming something that he probably could never have imagined. Well, he would, never have imagined himself being, but and that comes out of that love, that promise, that covenant, and with it, is given hope and again that bigger sense of identity and belonging and calling. But it's just, I suppose in this reading, I had the sense of everything's getting bigger. Think bigger. Think, see God in a bigger way. Enlarge your vision. Because God's got more for you than that. Thinking of how Abraham might have reacted. And yeah, I love the bit at the end, Mohammed, the fact that the blessing is for Sarah. That there is that definite. And this is for all, it's a kind of a spoken intent that this is inclusive. This is, again, it's enlarge your vision. This is going to be bigger than you could have, anyone could have imagined. Yeah. And then I guess reading back into it, the community of faith, as they were reading back on their story, what did that then mean to them about encouraging them to keep thinking bigger about what God was going to be doing for them? And what does it mean for us? How can we step into that story and not just keep it 2D and out there, but actually inhabit it and say, what God did, God is still doing. where is he doing it for me? Where is he doing it for us, the church?
Yeah. Thank you. That's a beautiful place to go with it. The big vision stuff. Yeah, and of course, and it's nations, isn't it? That's what really struck me. So it's nations in the plural, and then of course so much of it, of course, the text do take us into the specificity. No, I'm not sure that's the word. I can't even say. You know what I mean? The particularity, maybe that's the word, of Israel as the nation becomes, but the covenant is about the blessing of the nations in the plural. Vanessa says, I'll bring you in a second, Rachel, but Vanessa says, love how Sarah is included in this narrative, that she is important in building a nation, recognizing women have a vital role. And Andrew, who's commenting as St Edward's Castle Donington, but it's great to have you, Andrew, here, says, God gives us our true identity. Abraham was a scoundrel, don't forget. Yes, I always like to remind people, don't read the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures if you're looking for a guide on married life or on family life. There's some fairly disastrous examples, really. Rachel, this text, this story, this Abraham and Sarah, and what's getting you in your gut?
A couple of things, and weirdly, I'm reminded of Peter again in his marvelousness and then his instant rubbishness. Abraham's reaction to what's going on. So, God turns up and says, I'm going to do all this amazing stuff. Then Abraham fell on his face. I have a feeling I need to go away and read something about what that means. You know what I mean? I need to go find a book that tells me. But Abraham fell on his face. God has just turned up and said, ta-da! And his response is, good grief. And then it comes back again in verse 17, when we've had the promise of blessing for Sarah too. And this time Abraham fell on his face and laughed. And such a brilliant picture, the idea of him just sort of out of control in kind of joy and consternation and all sorts of things. And that just, quite often the Old Testament feels bereft of the kind of narrative that really connects you to the humanity of the people. And then when it does come in, I think it's really striking. When you do get something that really sort of really connects you to their humanity. My oldest son is called Isaac because of somebody preaching on this passage when I was at college. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rachel. Mohammed, do you want to respond again to the things that we've sort of shared as further thoughts on this?
Yes, I think what I would say is Old Testament is fantastic environment to knowing stories, to knowing the human raw stories. It's not just eliminating the beautiful people who done great job. They say what they did right, what they did wrong, as us be doing it, and God accept all of us in those concepts. I think what's again struck me in verse 5, he said, I have made you a father of many nations. It is God who made us. From the first place, God who made us, now God who made us who we are. And if you forget that as a nation, as individuals, as a church, as a community, if you forget God who made us, then that's very difficult place to be actually, because you need to do all good things to make yourself. And I think that Old Testament magnified is put huge light on that. If you do want to do yourself, that's the result. The New Testament said, come to me. I made you.
Yeah. Sense maybe again a sense of perspective again, and again maybe it ties in with a sense of losing ourself. Again, is maybe about putting down the self that puts makes us the creator, not the created. Sue says, although they're having a big discussion in the comments about Abraham and what a naughty person he was, and holding that with him being a great man of. So there's a lot of chat in the comments about that. And Sue says, it seems to me that there is something about not avoiding the bad stuff there, not avoiding the cross, not avoiding the bad bits in Abraham's story, because otherwise we lose sight of the enormity of God's grace, which actually is something, Mohammed, you were calling us back to. This is all about God. This is all about God's grace. It's not about us. let's leave the story for a moment, but we're gonna sort of hear it again through the lens of St. Paul, because our third reading on Sunday is from Romans. I just have to look it up. We are Romans 4, verse 13 to the end, and Paul is talking all about the whole chapter is the example of Abraham, God's promise realized through faith. So Rachel in the comments is getting a bit fed up with people lording over Abraham. You might want to tune out for this bit, because this is definitely St. Paul going large on Abraham, and he does mention Sarah as well, bless him, and about God's promise realized through faith. Elizabeth, I think you were going to start us off on this one, weren't you?
Yes, and there's that verse at the beginning, you know how you said earlier, you've got to kind of go with what came before. So right at the beginning, for the promise, it continues, doesn't it? Really, you can't really read this without having read the bit before. So we're kind of leaping off what he's just said about Abraham's faith, holding him out as the example for the church in trusting God, and he's expanding on that. And I think it's the verses that stuck out for me, reading it in this context now where we're at, were verse 18, that idea of hoping against hope. He believed. And then verse 21, being fully convinced that God was able to do. He trusted, and he had that faith to continue. And so I think, sort of reading it now in this context, we know what hope is, I think, in a new way, with the pandemic going on around us. And that sense of hoping against hope, will we come through the roadmap out of this? We hope we will, but, hope is very much a part of our everyday existence, I think, in a way, a much more kind of explicit out there way than maybe it's been. It's the language of how we're talking about, every day, often we talk about a sacred secular divide, but the two are really held together in that word, I think, hope and then trust. Well, what does trust look like? Who can we trust? Those are the sorts of questions that we've been asking again through this time, and so this is a call to trust in the one who is trustworthy, for me, that there is, and that is obviously what Abraham did, hoping against hope. But there's that, going back to that idea of humanity and flaws and things. I love that phrase, hoping against hope, because there's something in it that's like, it sort of says, I don't know if I can really do this. Is it really true? Can we really believe it? And there's that kind of grey area that we live in sometimes, where we do believe, but we need help with that little bit of really getting hold of the belief, taking hold of it for real. And as I was reading this, there was a prayer came to mind, and I don't know where it's come from, but somebody will recognise it who's familiar with liturgy. But somewhere it's a verse, and I can't place the verse, but the phrases that came to mind were, on the back of this, kind of as a response to reading this, was deepen our faith, enlarge our hope, but I also think widen our welcome, because I think that Paul is, he's saying in this passage, come on guys, who's in and who's out? That's what you're talking about. Well, I'm saying everybody's in this. This is, God is for all. And Abraham was that father of nations. Okay, so what do the nations look like? Well, that's everybody. So how well are we living this? And maybe that's a question for us now, is how well are we living that enormity again of God's vision for humanity in the world in relationship with him? Are we helping it? Are we hindering it?
Yeah. Just say those three ones again, Elizabeth, because I just think that's really important. Just say it again.
Deepen our faith. Is it the bit at the end? Deepen our faith, enlarge our hope. And then the bit that I added in my own kind of response was widen our welcome. I mean, other people will find a different way of expressing that, but broaden our welcome, increase our welcome, open us up to embrace the immenseness of what is being spoken about here.
What's being offered. Thank you. If anyone in the comments goes, I know where that's from, but it's just come out of Elizabeth. It's beautiful. And Chris says loves this. Rachel, what about you in this text? You don't always get on with Paul from previous muses, so try to just not have too much of a grump to start with, but just
I'm far too frank, I'm sorry. I'm far too frank about these things. I get a bit lost. I always do with the argument that's happening in Paul's head that I then have to decode. And actually, I suppose rather than comment on the text, one of the things I looked up as I was preparing for Sunday. I've just read a really good book by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, which I would highly recommend to anybody, called In God's Name, about religious violence. And there's masses of stuff about some of these passages from the Old Testament. Really, really helpful. And for the first time, I went and got my excerpts of the Talmud off my shelf. You know, one of those books that's just in the vicarage, you know, and thought, you know what, I want to kind of dig into what's going on with Abraham here. And actually, what I hit up against is what some of the people have been talking about in the comments, which is in the Talmud, the sense of Abraham as the blameless man. And actually, that's not how I see Abraham. It's not a picture I find helpful. And actually, it's not how I heard him described when I was reading the words of a very wise rabbi in a book. So, you know, so those are the things that are sort of doing battle in my mind as I read this. Yeah, the world did not come to Abraham or to his descendants through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. So perhaps a sense of the transcendence of one kind of self again, and the connection with another kind of self in the self, to go back to what Muhammad said, you know, the self as created, rather than created by God, rather than as created by us. So maybe that's my way back to Abraham too. Abraham as created by God, rather than as created by, yeah.
Thank you, Rachel. Chris picks up on the whole thing about the law thing at the start of this passage. You know, and he says, "Is Paul saying let's all be anarchists?" Oh, it's just scrolled up there. Let me just bring you back down again, Chris. But he says, "But it's the anarchy of love, not the anarchy of law. If you follow Christ and his teaching, you don't need laws as such, because you love God and your neighbour?" ? And Sue says, "Augustine, love God and do what you please." Mohammed, what's your response to the Romans reading, which, you know, again takes us back to Abraham? Where do you go with it?
Well, when I read these passages, we can't escape the jargon of Christian jargon called righteousness, which is, I think, is the base of a little bit of reformations, and it comes from that. Who is in, who is out, basically. So if I use the illustration of lockdown, it seems you are all locked down, and who is going out to see God, and who is going in, stay in this lockdown, in this world, in this sinful nature. That's the picture come to my mind. And if you look at the legalism, and if you like, last night they said you have to have like a vaccine passport. What is the vaccine passport? We can open the door, go and see God and love him and having relationship with him. And I think Paul here tried to say, it's not you who has a passport. It's not your work who has a passport. Look at the Abraham life. He had many doubts. He had, as Rachel mentioned, he laughed when God say, you're going to have a son. He laughed. He kind of the mockery God. But God still loved him because of the grace. It's not other people in the Old Testament. It is just purely the grace of God. And it's not just Abraham itself. He reckoned for us, for everybody, for all nations. So the vaccine passport comes in Jesus Christ, basically. Jesus who give us the grace, Jesus who opened the door, Jesus who say, come to me, not because of you and yourself, because I deny myself. So come to me, and then I take you to God. I think that's basic of Christianity. Everybody knows that. But again and again and again, every day, every moment, I think Paul reminded us, is reckoned for us. It didn't come out of me. It's reckoned for us. It was given to me. And that comes to relationship, and that's come to the hope which Elizabeth mentioned. In the future, we see all the beauty of God in one beautiful picture of the creation, and that's we here doing multiculturalism and doing, you know, intercultural pioneer minister and sort of stuff. We want to bring everybody together in front of God. I think that's the essence of these passages. The righteousness of God is not belong to me, is a gift to me. Yeah. And how much I take care of it by loving myself, loving God, and loving my neighbor.
Yeah. Thank you. What a beautiful image. Beautiful image. I just want to bring in a few of the comments before we come to, I always ask my guests what kind of sermon they might preach on Sunday, if they are like actually preaching, or if they would imagine themselves sort of into their context with these texts. But let me just share with you, Andrew's commenting on your comment, Elizabeth, your little 3-point thing, says, love that, Elizabeth, thank you, widen our welcome. And he says there's an Arabic thing about welcome to do with expanding your tent. Which then gets picked up. And Rachel says, talks about Abraham predates the law. He was operating the rawest form of the faith because the traditions weren't set out until much later. And then Hannah comes back in on the tent image. She says, yes, and expanding your tent is not about making everyone the same so they get in. It's about making the tent wider to allow more room, more love for everyone, just as they are. And that gets a few amens. It doesn't get any alleluias because we don't say alleluia in Lent. We're a liturgical church. So we've got tent widening, we've got a welcome. We've talked across a whole range of themes with these texts. As we're sort of coming to the end of our time together, what kind of sermon would you preach on these? What might be bubbling up for you? And you're all in very different contexts. Rachel, you said earlier you are preaching on Sunday. Is there something that's sort of shaping up for you where you want to take this? You talked a little bit earlier about the whole identity thing. Tell us more. What is bubbling away in your mind and the kind of sermon that you're going to preach?
It's to do with identity, and it's to do with the self as created by God, and the self that we might need to deny, I think there's stuff there about the self we've discovered through the adversities or challenges or just the sheer difference. I know some people haven't felt that you know, people have experienced the last year in very different ways, but you know, the things that we have found. And there was something Elizabeth said about thinking bigger, concerning that, because there's something about the way we think the world works and the way we've started to narrate that as Christians, perhaps sometimes as, well, the world's all like this now, but we're like this. And actually that sense of enlarging things and saying, actually, are we letting something else define our reality instead of acknowledging that we are all created self by God, brothers and sisters? It says there in that Romans, all who share the faith of Abraham. Well, that would be read quite differently today, wouldn't it? And it would have been when he wrote it. So, you know, yeah, that sense of enlarging too is going to come into it, but that's as far as I've got.
It might be a visual aid of a tent somewhere. That's a bit tricky still on the screen, but you could bring one in. Mohammed, what about you? Do you use the lectionary in your context, or what's preaching like for you?
Yes, we do use lectionaries. Also, this period we're going through a sermon series. But if I wanted to preach out of these three passages, I would have stick to Romans and Genesis. I love the concept of righteousness, and I think Baker in Encyclopedia of the Bible said something interesting, which I would have focused on that. He said Abraham was righteous because he ordered his life by the revealed will of God. And I think that's the essence of Christianity, how we see the revealed will of God in Jesus Christ. God revealed himself through him, and through him he revealed his will. And then how we can go forward. It doesn't matter if I'm at home or outside or in a pub, or I can't see friends or see friends or not. The revealed will of God is solid, is there. And if I stay in there, wherever I go, whichever country I go, wherever background I have, I can still live in this world with the joy, because God still loves me.
Wonderful. Sounds like a good sermon to preach. Elizabeth, you're a school chaplain, so you don't normally have in your ministry there have a classic sermon, but is there something of these texts that might find its way out into the different ways you minister as a chaplain in a school setting? And you can say no.
Yeah, they could be. I think my way into these texts, whether that was in a sermon or if I was trying to explore them, maybe in a conversation with a group of students, it might be to go through the idea of the name, and who do we call ourselves? Who does God call you? What does that mean about who you are now? What might it mean? How exciting could it be for the future? How scary is that? What are you going to trust? And who are you going to trust? And how can we all kind of persevere in the way that Jesus says we need to? And the model of trust that we've got offered to us in Abraham, how does that play out for us in the way that we respond to the things that we notice God nudging us to do and calling us to be? And probably an encouragement to just repeating myself, but keep thinking big. Don't close yourself down. Especially important, I think, for young folk to not think that they've got to follow one particular pattern trajectory, that this might just be for the next stage of the journey, like Abraham had various stages, and the disciples were on a journey with Jesus, and just as we are. Something along that, some musings on name.
Sounds good. This sounds good. Thank you so much. For me, I'm not preaching on Sunday. Liz Peaky is at All Saints. He's an ordinand with us. If I was preaching, I can't help but it's got to be the cross. It's got to be the gospel reading, because we're in a series of Lent called The Crown on the Cross. But all our conversation today, that this whole thing about the denying of self and what it is we're being asked to put down, because the challenge that we're trying to sit with at All Saints a little bit is how do we lay down the power that we have as the established church in the ways that works its way out in terms of institutional racism and so on, and actually what does that mean to let go of that? What does it mean to walk the way of the cross this Lent? So I would have to work with that, and some of the things you've been musing around the identity I think would form its way out, but I haven't got to write that sermon, so that is always a gift actually. It's just that's just the truth of it. So I've got to say thank you so much to Mohammed and Elizabeth and Rachel for joining us and for sharing all your thoughts and your wisdom. Thank you everyone who's in the comments. You're all having a lovely chat over there. All toxic positivity, that was a comment in there. That was a sermon that Sue might preach. So anyway, thank you everyone. Next week my guests are, she says, looking at her list, I am joined by returning guest Sharon Prentice, Natalia Nana Lester Bush, and Mark Poskett. Mark being of Northern soul as well, Rachel, so we'll keep the Northern flag flying, and some wonderful guests just to come and share with us. So do join us again next week, and we hope you have a wonderful muse through this week, walking with Jesus. Don't get lost in the wilderness, but remember, God's got you. That's a terrible ending. I'm going to stop talking now, and we'll see you all next week on Minister's Muse.